fans, this is Kurt DeVille with Counterpunch Boxing News, and I have some new news concerning Roy Jones Jr., Oleksandr Usyk, and this is a question for you. Could Roy Jones Jr. have figured Usyk out? I think, and you have to really, obviously they'd have to be at their peak. So I would say Roy at light heavy or cruiserweight. So it had to be in cruiserweight. That is a very, very good question because Roy Jones Jr. was very good. I think Roy in his prime could probably beat anyone because I think at the time he was pound for pound. But if you throw Usyk in there at cruiserweight, he was one of those guys that not only was he tall, he was taller than Roy, but he was also longer than Roy. And he had movements that I feel the Ukrainians didn't have at the time. I think the Ukrainian style has definitely evolved. The Volsniks, the Lomachenkos, the Usyks. I think those were the ideal premier examples of how the Ukrainian style with the technology and the approach that they use the conditioning to train has just went off the charts versus a guy that is physically gifted, a guy that has his legs, because believe it or not, and I do agree with Floyd Mayweather Jr. with this. Roy is a lot like Ali. The only difference is Roy he used his legs like Ali did. If you looked at the way he positioned, it's just, he didn't really throw many jabs to set up anything because he was so good at distance because of his physicality. I think physically, Roy Jones Jr. was an absolute specimen. That being said, Roy didn't have to set shots up and see where it's going to be. No, he just threw the shot. Bah! Boom! Boom! Overhand shots, leaping left hooks. And here's the problem, though. It's hard to say which will do what because none of these guys have showed you any opponent that they've been in there with like each other. In other words, nobody has been in Roy's era like Usyk, and no one has been when Usyk was at cruiserweight like Roy. So you ask yourself, you're like, well, damn, Roy was so good with speed, distance, timing, and then he was a powerful cruiserweight. And I'm not saying he was more powerful, but he had those hooks and those overhand rights. And I think, though, Roy was very, very good at southpaws, even though he eventually got knocked out in the light heavyweight division by a southpaw, Antonio Tarver. Yes. Okay. But he was very good at fighting them and defeating them. The Eric Hardings and, the Lou Del Valls. And, he fought these guys. And I think he was just very, very gifted at fighting southpaws. He fought at one point like 4 or 5 different southpaws, and it was crazy that, he was, go. He was so successful at fighting southpaw, so that could be a plus for him fighting someone like Usyk because the straight right, the overhand right, things of that nature. And it's crazy because Roy at cruiserweight seemed unstoppable. Usyk did have challenges at cruiserweight. The series, the World Boxing Series, Super Series. It was very challenging. I think that Roy, being in his absolute prime, could probably beat Oleksandr Usyk. Could he stop Usyk? I don't know if he could stop Usyk unless he hurt Usyk to stop Usyk. It's just Roy was very powerful as a 154 pounder, as a 160 pounder, at super middleweight, 168 pounder, light heavy even. He had power that people didn't realize he had. And I don't see Roy losing to Usyk. You know, heavyweight Usyk would get him because Roy wasn't a heavyweight. Usyk has deemed to become one, and probably one of the best of this era, heavyweight. But we have to be fair. Prime for prime, Roy Jones Jr. versus Oleksandr Usyk. I would give it to Roy based on the fact that Roy was able to do things that I've never seen before. Oleksandr Usyk has done things in the cruiserweight division that no one's done before. So if I had to give it to or predict forcefully, it would be Roy Jones Jr., 51% to 49%. It would be one of those fights because Roy, then I think Usyk would make Roy show the best of what he had. You know what I mean? He would definitely make Roy work, but I think in his prime, we would be able to see what Roy does with someone that does pressure him with in and out, back and forth movement, that was taller, that had longer reach. You know, like Calzaghe. It's just the only problem with Joe Calzaghe, the Italian Dragon, is the Italian Dragon fought Roy at a time that Roy wasn't Roy of old. Roy was just Roy. That was that at that time. That had been knocked out a few times. That wasn't, you know what I mean? He won some, then he lost some, then he won some. He was this guy that was still struggling and still challenging guys with the greatness that he still had left. But it was nothing compared to the greatness that he had when he was in his prime. So, you know, it is a very, very good debate. Roy Jones Jr. in his prime at cruiserweight against Oleksandr Usyk at cruiserweight. But you guys tell me what you think about this video about Roy Jones Jr. versus Oleksandr Usyk. Who would win? Of course, please subscribe. And you guys been Counterpunch. Peace.